So we know that you're more vulnerable to addiction if your parents are or were addicted, but does how they parent change that risk? Today I'm going to go into the how and why of intergenerational addiction. So we know that people whose parents are addicted or were addicted to drugs are more likely to also suffer from drug addiction. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Like, first, you have the genetic link. There's something going on with things like reward sensitivity, for example. I talk about that in another video. There's also this idea that you have more access to drugs and alcohol because your parents use them frequently. And they're also modeling this behavior. So they are using something, so you start to learn from them, but also they are just basically making it seem more socially acceptable at the same time. So all of those things on their own increase your vulnerability to addiction. And we know that parenting styles play a role in addiction too. So there are four main parenting styles. This is like going back to my intro class now. So they are depending on kind of this idea of warmth. So if somebody's low or high in warmth, so do they kind of respond? Do they care about what their kids are doing? And then also control. So this is something like discipline. Do they kind of have things like firm boundaries? And so the four different styles depend on things like level of control and warmth. So first you have authoritative. So authoritative is high on warmth, but also high on control. So these are parents who are like nurturing and affectionate, and they have clear boundaries, but they talk to their kids about those boundaries. They have this kind of like line of open communication. And then on the flip side of high control, like you see in authoritative, is authoritarian. So these are people who are high in control, but low on warmth, which is exactly what you think of. So these are people who demand obedience. They have very strict punishment. They're basically really inflexible and just kind of expect their children to obey what they say. And then the flip side of control from authoritarian is this low control and also low warmth. So these are known as like the neglectful or the uninvolved parents. So these are people who are emotionally detached. They don't really care about what their children are doing. They don't have a lot of interactions with them. They're like pretty self-absorbed, don't really have boundaries, or they're very inconsistent when they have them. So basically what you think of as like a narcissistic parent, that would be an example of this. And then the flip side of that, you have the kind of like permissive or indulgent parent. So this is somebody who basically wants their kid to be their best friend, not actually their kid. So the mother in Mean Girls. Basically they give in to their kids' every whim. There's like no boundaries whatsoever. So like a parent who spoils their kid a lot. But again, this is a parenting style, so it's not just in things like how often do you spoil them. It's like you have consistent curfews, you have consistent discipline. How is the communication between the parent and the child? All of those go into parenting styles. So we see that authoritative parents, their kids are less likely to use drugs. And all of the rest of the parenting styles, so neglectful, indulgent, authoritarian, all of those parenting styles are actually linked to more drug abuse. So basically it seems like there's one good one for drug abuse and then the rest are bad. Now good or bad here just means more or less likely to use drugs. I'm not trying to go on a moral platform. And neglectful parenting styles were actually seemingly the worst in terms of how likely their kids were to use drugs. So if the parents just basically didn't care about their kids, had no boundaries whatsoever, their kids were far more likely to use drugs. So we know that kids whose parents use drugs are more vulnerable to addiction, but could the parenting style actually like decrease that vulnerability? So maybe not bring it down to nothing, like maybe not make them just as likely to use drugs, but could it reduce it at all? And that's what this specific study was looking at. This specific study looked at this kind of giant subset of teenagers who take the survey in Brazil. So they basically give them the survey at a very specific time in school, and then they look at things like how likely they are to use drugs. So this is all self-report. So self-report of drugs from teenagers is, I mean, not that valid, but it is not as bad as you would think it would be. People don't lie as often as you would expect. So they basically looked at the survey response and did this like wild statistical technique. I don't fully understand it. Latent class analysis, if you understand it, please tell me. But they did that, and they looked to see if parenting styles would actually kind of change that vulnerability. Could their parenting styles maybe reduce that risk? So here's what they found. The first thing that they found is, yeah, if their parents used multiple drugs, they were also more likely to use multiple drugs, which we already knew. But if their parents had that authoritative parenting style, it reduced that risk. So again, didn't bring it down to zero. They still had increased vulnerability to addiction. It just lessened that. And that was not true for any of the other styles. And they found that a lot of parents actually had different use patterns than their kid did. So this kind of suggests that, yeah, there's an increased risk for addiction, but it's not this like, okay, if your parents drink, you're guaranteed to drink. If your parents use two drugs, you're more likely to also use two drugs. The only time that you really saw that relationship was with parents who abstained from drugs. Their children were far more likely to abstain from drugs. And this is a really important point. I do not want people to think that if their parents are addicted, that guarantees that they're going to become addicted. That's true for like basically everything. So yeah, if your parents use a drug, you're more likely to use a drug, but you're not guaranteed to use that. Just like if your father has schizophrenia, you're not guaranteed to get schizophrenia. More vulnerable? Yes. Guaranteed? No. And also, this study found that the alcohol relationship was particularly strong. So parenting style did not seem to influence whether a child was more likely to use alcohol. That link seemed to exist no matter what, which suggests that there's something specific going on with alcohol that we should probably look into more. But as always, this study was correlational, not causal. So we are not making people become addicted to things. We're just looking to see what happens. And there's a lot of other things that are associated with parenting styles. So how much stress the parent is under, that changes what style they're likely to use. Socioeconomic status, which is also linked to stress. What style your parents used. All of those change the likelihood of what style you are to use. This study is getting at a really important question. Parenting styles are linked to a different risk for addiction, even in children who are at increased risk in the first place, which is incredibly important to know. Let me know what your thoughts are on parenting and addiction, and if there's anything specific that you think we should be looking into.